The office droned on with the same old monotony of another workday. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights mixed with the clatter of keyboards and the low murmur of conversations. I sat at my desk, mindlessly typing out an email, my thoughts drifting to the same question that always haunted me. What's the point of all this? 5 years. 5 years of showing up early, staying late, and pouring everything I had into a company that barely even noticed me. I was the reliable one, the diligent secretary who never missed a deadline or forgot a detail. But that's all I was. Just Emily, the secretary. No promotions, no recognition, just the occasional polite thank you and a lukewarm smile here and there. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our channel and like our videos. Every click matters to us. It keeps us motivated to share more meaningful stories. If you enjoy our content, feel free to share it and leave questions below. Every interaction helps build a closer, more connected community. I'm truly grateful for your support, and I hope you'll stay with us until the end of the video. I glanced at the clock. Another hour, and the office would start to empty out, leaving me behind, as usual, to finish up the reports no one else wanted to touch. The thought made my chest tighten. I wanted more. I needed more. But after so many years, I wasn't even sure I still believed I deserved it. Emily. His voice snapped me out of my thoughts, and I turned to see Mr. Carter standing a few feet away, a file in his hand. Just thinking his name sent a ripple through me. He was the CEO. The kind of man who seemed to command the entire company with nothing more than a glance. In his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit that hugged his tall, broad frame, he exuded power. His gray eyes were sharp, almost piercing, and when they landed on you, it felt like he could see right through you. Yes, Mr. Carter. I straightened in my chair, trying to ignore the flutter of nerves his presence always stirred. I need this finalized by morning, he said, placing the file on my desk. His tone was clipped but not unkind. We have a presentation with the board tomorrow. Of course, I said, nodding. I'll take care of it. Good. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to mine for a brief moment. His expression softened, and for a second, I thought he might say something else. But then he straightened, his professional mask slipping back into place. Thank you, Emily. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne, a mix of cedar and something darker. Something that lingered long after he was gone. By the time the office emptied out, it was nearly 7. The once bustling space was now silent, save for the hum of the HVAC system and the occasional shuffle of the janitor's cart. I was alone, as usual, surrounded by stacks of papers and the faint glow of my computer screen. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The file Mr. Carter had left for me was spread out across my desk, pages of data and charts that needed to be compiled into a polished presentation. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but I didn't mind. In some strange way, I found comfort in the routine. It was something I could control, unlike the rest of my life. The thought made me glance at my phone, where a text from my husband, Jason, sat unanswered. What time will you be home? He'd asked hours ago. I hadn't replied. I knew he wouldn't be upset. Jason never got upset. But that was part of the problem. He was too easygoing, too complacent. Our marriage had become a quiet, predictable routine. And though I cared for him deeply, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I shook the thought away and turned back to my work. This wasn't the time to dwell on my personal life. I had a job to finish. Still here? The voice startled me, and I looked up to see Mr. Carter standing in the doorway of his office. His tie was loosened, and the top button of his shirt was undone, revealing a hint of tan skin beneath. He looked different, almost human, without his usual polished exterior. Just finishing up the presentation, I said, gesturing to the file on my desk. I'll have it ready for you by morning. He nodded, stepping further into the room. You're always the last one here. I shrugged, offering a small smile. Someone has to make sure everything gets done. His lips quirked into a faint smile, but there was something in his eyes, something softer, almost contemplative. I don't think I've ever properly thanked you for everything you do around here. This place wouldn't run half as smoothly without you. The words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Praise from Mr. Carter was rare, almost unheard of. Thank you, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a beat too long before he turned to leave. Don't stay too late, he said over his shoulder. I won't, I lied. As soon as he was gone, I let out a shaky breath, my mind racing. What was that? He was just being polite, I told myself. There was no reason to read into it. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the warmth his words had stirred in me, the way my heart had raced when he looked at me. I forced myself to focus, determined to finish the presentation and put the whole interaction out of my mind. But as the hours ticked by and the office grew darker, his voice echoed in my head, "This place wouldn't run half as smoothly without you." When I finally got home, Jason was asleep on the couch, the faint glow of the TV casting shadows across his face. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. He looked peaceful, his features softened in sleep, and for a fleeting second, I felt a pang of guilt. Jason was a good man, steady, dependable, kind. He didn't deserve a wife who was thinking about another man. But it wasn't like I had done anything wrong, I told myself. Mr. Carter was my boss, nothing more. And yet, as I climbed into bed beside Jason and stared at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of those lingering gray eyes, the faint smile that seemed meant only for me. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, as usual. The presentation was waiting on Mr. Carter's desk when he walked in, his tie perfectly knotted and his suit freshly pressed. He glanced at the file, then at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw that same softness from the night before. "You've outdone yourself, as always," he said, his tone even but sincere. "Just doing my job," I replied. "Just doing my job," I replied, though the compliment sent a thrill through me. He gave me a small nod, then disappeared into his office, leaving me alone once again. I turned back to my desk, determined to focus on my work, but the memory of his voice lingered, a quiet echo I couldn't ignore. As the day wore on, I caught myself glancing at his office door more often than I cared to admit, waiting for some excuse to see him again. But he stayed behind that closed door, his presence a constant reminder of the boundaries I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. By the end of the day, I was no closer to figuring out what was happening between us, if anything at all. But as I packed up my things and prepared to head home, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered the truth I didn't want to admit. Whatever it was, I didn't want it to stop. The office felt unusually quiet that evening. Most of the team had left hours ago, and I was alone at my desk, tying up loose ends. The faint hum of the HVAC system and the rhythmic ticking of the clock were my only companions. The warm glow of my desk lamp illuminated the scattered reports in front of me, casting long shadows on the sleek, polished surface. I'd told myself I'd leave early tonight. I always told myself that. Yet here I was again, the last one in the office, fueled by a mix of dedication and the nagging desire to prove myself worthy of something more. The faint click of a door opening broke my concentration, and I turned to see Mr. Carter stepping out of his office. He looked different, his jacket was off, his tie loosened, and his shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, tan skin. The faint creases around his eyes softened his usual commanding presence, and for a moment, he didn't look like the untouchable CEO I'd spent years working for. He looked human. "You're still here," he said, his voice low and resonant in the stillness of the office. I straightened in my chair, caught off guard. "Just finishing up the expense reports. I wanted to make sure they were ready for tomorrow." He nodded, walking closer until he was standing just a few feet from my desk. His gaze flicked over the papers scattered in front of me before settling on my face. "You work harder than anyone else here, Emily. You know that, don't you?" His words caught me off guard, and I felt a faint warmth rise in my cheeks. "I'm just doing my job," I said, looking down. He smiled faintly, but there was something in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. "You do far more than that." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Then, as if sensing the tension, he stepped back and gestured toward his office. "I'm reviewing the final proposal for tomorrow's board meeting. Would you mind taking a look? I could use a second opinion." "Of course," I said quickly, eager for any excuse to keep talking to him. I followed him into his office, the space dimly lit by a single desk lamp. The soft lighting made the room feel smaller, more intimate. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, but instead of sitting down himself, he leaned against the edge of the desk, his arms crossed as he handed me the proposal. "I'm trying to make sure it's airtight," he said, his tone thoughtful. "This deal could be a game changer for the company." I nodded, scanning the document in front of me. The numbers and projections blurred slightly as I read, my focus divided between the words on the page and the man standing so close. I felt the weight of his gaze on me, and I couldn't help but glance up. "Do you ever stop working?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He chuckled softly, the sound warm and surprisingly disarming. "Not often. But I could ask the same of you." I smiled faintly, looking back down at the document. "I guess I like to keep busy." "That much is obvious," he said, his voice softer now. "But I can't help wondering, are you happy here, Emily?" The question took me by surprise, and I looked up to meet his gaze. There was something in his expression, something genuine, almost vulnerable, that made it impossible to give a simple answer. I enjoy what I do, I said carefully. But sometimes I wonder if there's more I could contribute. His eyes held mine for a moment before he nodded, as though he understood exactly what I meant. I'd been thinking the same thing. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My breath caught, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was imagining the way he looked at me, the faint trace of something more than professional admiration in his gray eyes. Emily, he said, his voice low. You're an invaluable part of this company. And I don't say that lightly. Thank you, I murmured, the words catching in my throat. He straightened, breaking the moment as he walked around the desk to sit in his chair. I'd like to see you take on more responsibility. I think you're capable of much more than what your current role allows. My heart leapt at his words. For years, I'd waited for someone to recognize my potential, and now it was finally happening. But there was something about the way he said it, something about the way he looked at me, that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I'd love that, I said, my voice steadier now. I've always wanted to do more. He smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. Good. Then we'll start discussing some possibilities next week. Thank you, I said again, unable to keep the gratitude from spilling out. That means a lot to me. You've earned it, he said simply. By the time I left his office, the building was completely silent, the hallways dark except for the faint glow of the emergency lights. As I gathered my things and headed for the elevator, my mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. I told myself it was purely professional, that Mr. Carter had simply recognized my hard work and wanted to reward it. But the way he looked at me, the way his voice had softened when he said my name, it felt like something more. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor, leaning back against the wall as the door slid shut. The faint scent of his cologne still clung to me, and I couldn't stop the memory of his eyes, his smile, from replaying in my mind. When I finally walked through the door of my apartment, Jason was in the kitchen, heating up leftovers. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mix of relief and concern. Long night? He asked. Yeah, I said, dropping my bag on the counter. Just busy with work. He nodded, his attention already shifting back to the microwave. I stood there for a moment, watching him as he stirred the food, his movements slow and methodical. There was nothing wrong with Jason, nothing at all. He was kind, dependable, the sort of husband most women would dream of. And yet, as I stood there in the dim light of our kitchen, I couldn't stop thinking about someone else. I brushed the thought away, telling myself it was nothing, just a passing moment of admiration for a man who saw potential in me. But even as I climbed into bed that night, the memory of Mr. Carter lingered, his words echoing in my mind. I got to the office earlier than usual, determined to shake off the strange haze that had settled over me. But as I passed by Mr. Carter's office on my way to my desk, I couldn't help but glance inside. He was already there, his head bent over a stack of papers, the faint lines of concentration etched across his face. I forced myself to keep walking, but the flutter in my chest refused to subside. Something was happening, something I couldn't quite name, and as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't deny the truth. I didn't want it to stop. The days that followed felt surreal. I threw myself into my work with a renewed sense of purpose, tackling every task with a fervor that surprised even me. The responsibilities Mr. Carter had hinted at were slowly starting to take shape, and I relished every opportunity to prove myself. Yet, beneath the surface of my professional ambition, a quieter, more dangerous feeling lingered, one I was too afraid to fully name. Mr. Carter and I spoke more frequently now. Our conversations, though professional, carried an undercurrent that neither of us acknowledged. A lingering glance here, a soft smile there. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my heart race whenever he entered the room. One Friday evening, as the office began to empty, I found myself once again working late. The glow of my computer screen illuminated the tidy stack of files on my desk, and I was so absorbed in my work that I didn't notice him approach until he was standing right in front of me. Emily, he said softly. I looked up, startled. Oh, Mr. Carter. I didn't hear you. He smiled, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, as they often were after hours. You're always here late. I shrugged, feeling a faint blush creep up my neck. There's always something that needs to get done. You could let someone else handle it once in a while, he said, his tone light but with a hint of concern. You deserve to have a life outside of this place. I laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. I don't mind. I like staying busy. He leaned against the edge of my desk, his gaze steady. You work harder than anyone I've ever met, Emily. It doesn't go unnoticed. The sincerity in his voice made my breath catch, and for a moment, I couldn't look away from his eyes. There was something disarming about the way he said my name, as though it carried a weight I didn't fully understand. Thank you, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze lingered on me for a beat too long before he straightened, clearing his throat. I was about to pour myself a drink. Would you like one? I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was already past 8, and the office was practically deserted. Part of me knew I should decline, but the other part, the part that had been yearning for these moments, couldn't resist. Sure, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded and disappeared into his office, returning a moment later with 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine for just a second, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through me. Cheers, he said, raising his glass. Cheers, I echoed, taking a small sip. The warmth of the whiskey spread through me, easing some of the tension in my shoulders. We stood there in silence for a moment, the faint hum of the HVAC system the only sound. I glanced out the window, where the city lights twinkled against the night sky, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only 2 people in the world. You've been with the company for 5 years now, he said suddenly, his tone thoughtful. Almost 6, I corrected, a small smile tugging at my lips. He chuckled softly. That's right. And in all that time, you've never once complained, never once asked for more than what you were given. Why is that? The question caught me off guard, and I took a moment to consider my answer. I guess I've always felt that if I worked hard enough, someone would notice eventually, that I wouldn't have to ask. And has anyone noticed? He asked, his gaze piercing. I hesitated, my heart pounding. You have. The words hung in the air, heavier than I intended, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. His expression softened, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. You're right, he said finally, his voice quiet. I have. The following week was a whirlwind of activity. The new responsibilities he'd given me kept me busier than ever, and I barely had time to think about anything else. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the work, my thoughts always drifted back to that evening, the warmth of his voice, the intensity of his gaze, the unspoken words that lingered between us. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a proposal in the break room, he walked in. His presence immediately commanded my attention. Emily, he said, his voice warm. How's the project coming along? It's going well, I replied, setting down the document. I think we're on track to meet the deadline. Good, he said, leaning against the counter. I knew I could count on you. I smiled, feeling a familiar flutter in my chest. Thank you. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. You've been handling everything so well lately. I hope you know how much I appreciate it. I'm just doing my job, I said, though the words felt inadequate. He shook his head slightly, his gaze steady. You do far more than that. The silence that followed was charged, and I felt my pulse quicken as he took a step closer. His voice softened as he said, Emily, you've always been the person I can rely on. And I don't say that lightly. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. Thank you, I said. He smiled faintly, his eyes searching mine. I mean it. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. The noise of the office faded away, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, the rapid thud of my heart. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, the sound of footsteps approaching broke the spell. He stepped back, his expression quickly shifting back to its usual professional demeanor. Keep up the good work, he said, his voice brisk. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, breathless and reeling. That evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing the final draft of the proposal, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The way he had looked at me, the way his voice had softened when he said my name. It all felt too real, too significant to ignore. I glanced at his office, where the light was still on, and for a moment, I considered walking over, asking him what he meant by it all. But before I could move, his door opened, and he stepped out, his eyes meeting mine across the empty office. Emily, he said, his voice carrying across the quiet space. Can I see you for a moment? I nodded, my heart racing as I stood and followed him into his office. Whatever this was, it was far from over. The air in Mr. Carter's office felt heavier than usual, charged with a tension I couldn't quite name. The faint hum of the city filtered in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the room, it was silent, save for the soft click of the door as I closed it behind me. Have a seat, he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of something deeper. I sat, folding my hands in my lap to still their trembling. He leaned against his desk, his tie loosened, his gaze steady as he studied me. For a moment, I felt like he could see right through me, past the professionalism I tried so hard to maintain. I wanted to talk to you about the new project, he began, his tone measured. You've been handling it exceptionally well. Thank you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening. But I also wanted to check in. You've been taking on a lot lately. I need to know if you're okay with it, if it's too much. His concern caught me off guard, and I hesitated before responding. I'm fine, really. I've been enjoying the work. I'm glad to hear that, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. But I don't want you to burn out. You're too important to this company, to me, for that. The weight of his words hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I searched his face for any hint of insincerity, but there was none. His eyes held mine, steady and unflinching, and the room seemed to shrink around us. I appreciate that, I said finally, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and the faint scent of his cologne reached me, a mix of cedar and something darker, more intoxicating. My heart pounded in my chest as he leaned against the edge of the desk, his proximity sending a jolt through me. Emily, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. You've been working here for years, and I've come to rely on you more than anyone else. I don't know if I've ever told you how much I value that. You have, I said quickly, my voice shaky. I mean, you've always been supportive. He smiled faintly, his gaze never leaving mine. Not as much as I should have. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt my pulse quicken as he reached for the edge of his desk, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, caught in the intensity of the moment. Emily, he said again, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't quite name. I hope you know how much I respect you. How much I admire everything you do. Thank you, I whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. His gaze softened, and for a moment, it felt like the air between us shifted, like the unspoken tension that had been building for weeks had finally reached its breaking point. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the way he was looking at me, as though I was the only person in the room, the only person who mattered. The sound of a phone ringing broke the spell, and he straightened, stepping back as he glanced toward his desk. I should get that, he said, his voice brisk once more. Of course, I said, standing quickly and smoothing my skirt. I'll let you get back to work. He hesitated, his gaze flicking back to me for a brief moment before he nodded. Thank you, Emily. I left the office, my heart racing as I walked back to my desk. The weight of the moment lingered, heavy and undeniable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in my mind. Jason slept soundly beside me, his breathing even and steady, but I felt 1,000 miles away. The memory of Mr. Carter's touch, his voice, his gaze consumed me, no matter how much I tried to push it aside. It refused to fade. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of vulnerability. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The following week, I avoided him as much as I could. I buried myself in work, taking on extra tasks and staying at my desk for hours on end. But no matter how much I tried to distance myself, he was always there, a presence I couldn't ignore. One evening, as I was gathering my things to leave, his voice stopped me in my tracks. Emily. I turned to see him standing in the doorway of his office, his tie loosened and his expression unreadable. Can we talk for a moment? I hesitated, my heart pounding. Of course. I followed him into his office, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. He closed the door behind me, and for a moment, we stood there in silence, the air heavy with unspoken words. I've noticed you've been avoiding me, he said finally, his tone soft but firm. I haven't been avoiding you, I said quickly, though the lie felt hollow even as I said it. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. You don't have to lie, Emily. I just want to understand why. I looked down at my hands, my fingers twisting nervously. I've been busy. I see, he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Is that all it is? I hesitated, my throat tight as I struggled to find the right words. I don't want to cross any lines. His expression softened, and he stepped closer, his voice low and reassuring. You haven't crossed any lines, Emily. And you won't, unless you want to. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't speak, caught in the intensity of the moment. I began, but the words died in my throat. His gaze held mine, steady and unflinching. If this is too much, tell me. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. You're not, I said quickly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and he nodded. Good. For a moment, the silence between us was unbearable, the weight of everything left unsaid pressing down on me. But before I could say anything, he stepped back, his professional demeanor snapping back into place. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice brisk once more. "That will be all for tonight." I nodded, my heart still racing as I left the office. The weight of the moment lingered, heavy and undeniable, and I knew that whatever this was, it was far from over. The days following that night in his office blurred into one another. I threw myself into my work, desperate to avoid the thoughts that seemed to spiral out of control whenever I let my guard down. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, Mr. Carter was always there, in the back of my mind, in the air between us during meetings, and in the way he lingered just a moment too long when our paths crossed. It felt like a game we were both too afraid to admit we were playing, one where every glance and unspoken word pushed us closer to a line neither of us was sure we should cross. It was late one evening when everything came to a head. The office was deserted, the lights dimmed except for the soft glow of the desk lamp that cast long shadows across the floor. I was at my desk, finishing up the revisions on a report that was due the next morning, when his voice startled me. I looked up to see him standing a few feet away, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. There was something in his expression, something raw, almost vulnerable, that made my pulse quicken. "Mr. Carter," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't realize you were still here." He took a step closer, his gaze holding mine. "I could say the same about you." I shrugged, forcing a small smile. "Just finishing up some work." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "You always are." There was a pause, heavy and charged, before he spoke again. "Can I ask you something, Emily?" "Of course," I said, though my heart was pounding. "Why do you stay so late? Is it just the work, or is there something else keeping you here?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I hesitated, my voice faltering. "I guess I like the quiet," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The quiet," he repeated, his tone low. "Or the company?" The air between us seemed to crackle, and I felt my breath hitch. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know what to say that wouldn't give me away entirely. So instead, I said nothing, letting the silence stretch between us. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and I could feel the heat of his presence even before he spoke again. "Emily," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I'm out of line, tell me. But I don't think I am." My heart pounded in my chest, and I looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt. But there was none. His eyes were steady, his expression open, and in that moment, I felt something shift, something I couldn't take back. "You're not," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. He exhaled softly, and the faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Good." What happened next felt like a dream, one I wasn't sure I wanted to wake up from. He leaned closer, his movements tentative, as though giving me every opportunity to stop him. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my breath catching as his hand brushed against mine. "Emily," he said again, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't name. "I've been trying to fight this, whatever this is, for weeks, but I can't anymore." Neither could I. The words hovered on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to say them. Instead, I let the silence speak for me, my gaze meeting his in a way that left no room for doubt. He moved closer, his hand brushing against my cheek, and I felt a shiver run through me. His touch was warm, gentle, and I found myself leaning into it without even thinking. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice so soft it was almost a plea. I shook my head, my breath hitching as I whispered, "Don't." That was all it took. He closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a way that sent a jolt through my entire body. The kiss was tentative at first, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened. The weight of everything we'd been holding back crashed down around us. I didn't think, couldn't think. All I could do was feel the warmth of his hands on my skin, the intensity of his gaze when he pulled back just enough to look at me. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of feelings raging inside me. The hours that followed felt like a blur, a heavy mix of passion and emotions that I couldn't fully process. We didn't speak much. There were no words that could capture the enormity of what was happening. Instead, we let our actions speak for us. The quiet intimacy of the moment said more than words ever could. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows, that reality began to creep back in. I sat on the edge of the couch in his office, my clothes rumpled and my hair a mess, while he stood by the window, his back to me. "We shouldn't have done this," I said finally, my voice breaking the heavy silence. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" I hesitated, my heart aching at the thought. "No. But that doesn't mean it wasn't a mistake." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. I know. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I wanted to say something, anything, that would make the heaviness go away, but I didn't know how. I should go, I said finally, standing and smoothing down my skirt. He didn't try to stop me, but as I walked toward the door, his voice stopped me in my tracks. Emily. I turned to look at him, my breath catching at the way he was looking at me, like he wasn't sure if he was letting me go or watching me leave forever. Take care of yourself, he said softly. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and walked out the door. The sound of it closing behind me echoed in the empty office. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop the tears that spilled down my cheeks. I told myself it was for the best, that whatever this was, it couldn't last. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been irrevocably changed. No matter what happened next, I couldn't go back to the way things were before. The office was quiet as I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the computer screen. The weight of what had happened the night before lingered in my chest, heavy and unrelenting. I had told myself it was a mistake, one born out of exhaustion and vulnerability. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't forget the feel of his hands, the warmth of his breath, or the intensity in his eyes. It was wrong. I knew that. And yet, the thought of seeing him again sent a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. His voice pulled me from my thoughts, and I looked up to see Mr. Carter standing by my desk. He was as composed as ever, his suit immaculate and his expression unreadable. But there was something in his gaze, a flicker of vulnerability, that made my heart race. Can I see you in my office? He asked, his tone soft. I nodded, standing and smoothing down my skirt as I followed him down the hallway. My stomach churned with nerves as I stepped into his office, the door clicking shut behind me. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, unable to calm the frantic beating of my heart. He moved to lean against his desk, his hands gripping the edge as he watched me. About last night, he began, his voice low. I know, I interrupted, my voice trembling. It shouldn't have happened. His jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment before meeting my gaze again. Do you regret it? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I hesitated, my throat tightening as I searched for the right words. I don't know, I admitted finally. I don't know how to feel. He nodded slowly, his expression softening. I understand. We stood there in silence, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing down on us. Finally, he took a step closer, his movement slow and deliberate. Emily, he said softly. I know this is complicated. I know it's not fair to you. But I can't pretend like nothing's changed. No, I whispered, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Neither can I. His gaze held mine, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world faded away. The tension between us crackled like a live wire, and I found myself unable to look away. Then what do we do? He asked, his voice tinged with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I shook my head, my hands trembling. I don't know. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I threw myself into my work, hoping to find solace in the routine, but nothing could distract me from the growing tension between us. Every time our eyes met, the air seemed to grow heavier, and every fleeting touch sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just a passing infatuation. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't going away. It was a week later when everything came to a head. The office was nearly empty, most of the staff having left for the evening. I was at my desk, finishing up a report, when I felt his presence behind me. Emily. I turned to see him standing there, his tie loosened and his expression unreadable. Yes, Mr. Carter? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Can I see you in my office? He asked, his tone soft. I nodded, standing and following him down the hallway. My heart raced as I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a quiet click. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. He moved to lean against his desk, his gaze steady as he watched me. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath caught, and I looked away, my cheeks flushing. You shouldn't, I said, though the words felt hollow. I know, he said, his tone heavy with regret. But I can't help it. I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay composed. This isn't fair, I said, my voice trembling. To either of us. No, it's not, he agreed, stepping closer. But that doesn't change how I feel. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. The intensity there made my pulse quicken, and I felt my resolve begin to crumble. David, I said softly, his name feeling foreign on my tongue. What are we doing? He reached for my hand, his touch gentle. I don't know, he admitted. But I don't want to stop. The honesty in his words made my chest ache, and I found myself unable to pull away. Neither do I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. What happened next felt inevitable. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against my cheek as he leaned in. His kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but it quickly deepened. The weight of everything we'd been holding back crashed down around us. I couldn't think. All I could do was feel the warmth of his touch and the intensity of his gaze consuming me completely. It was reckless and dangerous, but in that moment, it was the only thing that felt real. When it was over, we stood in silence, the weight of what had happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle as he whispered, "I don't regret it." "Neither do I admitted, my voice barely audible. But as I left his office that night, the reality of what we'd done began to sink in. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross, and I wasn't sure what that meant for either of us. The next morning, the tension in the office was palpable. I avoided his gaze whenever I could, the weight of our shared secret pressing down on me with every passing moment. But no matter how much I tried to distance myself, he was always there, his presence a constant reminder of what we'd done. It wasn't until the end of the day that he approached me, his voice low and filled with a quiet intensity. "Emily," he said softly, "can we talk?" I hesitated, my heart racing as I nodded. "Of course." I followed him into his office, the door closing behind us with a soft click. The air between us felt heavier than ever, and I knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The sound of the door closing behind me echoed louder than it should have in the still office. His presence filled the room as it always did, and I could feel the tension radiating off him before he even spoke. "Emily," he began, his voice low and steady, but I could hear the edge of uncertainty beneath it. "We need to talk." I nodded, though my heart was pounding. I'd known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure I was ready for it. "Yes, we do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, but I stayed standing, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. He sighed softly, running a hand through his hair as he leaned against the edge of his desk. "I can't stop thinking about what happened," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "And I don't know what to do about it." "Neither do I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes snapped up to meet mine, and the raw emotion I saw there took my breath away. He looked vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before, and it made my chest ache. "I know this is complicated," he said, his tone soft. "I know it's not fair to you. But I need to know where you stand." "Where I stand?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "I don't even know where I stand, David. Everything about this feels impossible." He nodded slowly, his expression pained. "It does." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until I couldn't take it anymore. "We crossed a line," I said, my voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "And I don't know how to go back." "Do you want to go back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my throat tightening as I searched for the answer. "I don't know," I admitted finally. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands clenching at his sides. "I know you're right," he said softly. "But that doesn't make it any easier." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It doesn't." The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance. We spoke only when necessary, our conversations clipped and professional. But the weight of what had happened hung over us like a cloud. I told myself it was for the best, that putting distance between us would make things easier. But it didn't. If anything, it made the ache in my chest worse. I avoided him as much as I could, burying myself in work and finding excuses to be out of the office whenever possible. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape him. He was always there, always in the background, a constant presence lingering in the corner of my mind. Every time our eyes met across the room, it felt as though the air itself shifted, charged with something unspoken, something electric. The tension between us crackled like a live wire, impossible to ignore yet equally impossible to acknowledge in front of others. It was a silent, magnetic pull, growing stronger each time our gazes locked. And yet, neither of us dared to speak of it. It wasn't until the following week that everything came to a head. The moment was subtle at first, hidden within the mundane structure of a company-wide meeting. He was at the front of the room, presenting the quarterly results with his usual composure. His voice was calm, steady, and professional as he addressed the team, breaking down the numbers and analyzing the data with a precision that commanded attention. But no matter how collected he seemed on the surface, his eyes betrayed him. Time and time again, they flicked toward me, meeting mine across the rows of seated colleagues. I tried to focus on the slides, on the graphs and charts he pointed to, but it was a losing battle. All I could hear was his voice, his measured tone cutting through the room. But in my mind, it wasn't the voice of a team leader presenting metrics. It was the voice that had whispered my name in quiet moments, a tone filled with something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken. When the meeting ended, I gathered my things quickly, determined to leave before anyone could catch my hesitation. I wanted to escape, to put some distance between us and the intensity one felt whenever he was near. But as I rounded the corner toward my desk, I felt it, his presence. Before he even spoke, I knew he was there. "Emily," he called softly, his voice stopping me in my tracks. I froze, my breath catching as I turned slowly to face him. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat loud and insistent. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Yes?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice was low, careful, as though he was afraid of breaking the fragile silence between us. I hesitated, glancing around the empty hallway. There was no one else in sight, just the two of us, standing on the edge of a conversation we both knew would change everything. Finally, I nodded. "Okay." Without another word, he gestured toward his office, and I followed him. The walk felt longer than it was, every step amplifying the tension between us. When we entered, he closed the door softly behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place echoed in the small space. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of all the things we hadn't said. I stood near the door, unsure whether to move closer or keep my distance. He walked to his desk but didn't sit. Instead, he turned toward me, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. I swallowed hard, his words hitting me like a punch to the chest. My throat felt tight, and it took all my strength to keep my voice steady. "Neither can I admitted, the words coming out softer than I intended. For a moment, he just looked at me. His expression was unguarded, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. I'd never seen him like this before. His eyes searched mine as though looking for an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my hands gripping the edge of the chair in front of me. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice trembling. "But we can't keep doing this. It's not fair to either of us." He looked away, his jaw tightening as he processed my words. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the tension in his body mirroring the storm brewing inside me. "You're right," he said after a long pause, his voice softer now, resigned. "It's not." For a long moment, we stood in silence, the air between us heavy with everything we couldn't bring ourselves to say. The unspoken emotions wrapped around us like an invisible chain, each link forged by the weight of feelings neither of us dared to name. I wanted desperately to break the silence, to say something, anything, that might ease the ache in both our hearts. But the words wouldn't come. They stuck in my throat, stubborn and unyielding, leaving me helpless. Finally, he broke the stillness, his voice so quiet it was barely audible. "I care about you, Emily," he said, his eyes searching mine. "More than I should." I felt a sharp pang in my chest and closed my eyes, forcing myself to hold back the tears threatening to spill. "I care about you too," I confessed, my voice trembling under the weight of the truth. "But that doesn't mean this is any easier." "No," he agreed softly, shaking his head. "It doesn't." When I got home that night, the conversation played on a relentless loop in my mind, each word echoing louder than the last. The solitude of my apartment felt oppressive, the silence deafening in Jason's absence. He was away on a business trip, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself resenting the emptiness of the space. Hoping to dull the ache gnawing at my chest, I poured myself a glass of wine and sank onto the couch. But no amount of wine could quiet the memories that clung to me, the way his voice had trembled when he said my name, the look in his eyes when he admitted the very thing we both knew we shouldn't feel. I tried to tell myself it was over, that we had made the right decision by agreeing to keep our distance. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. A part of me clung stubbornly to the hope I wasn't ready to let go of, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, I forced myself to arrive at the office earlier than usual, thinking that if I avoided him, the ache might ease, at least for a little while. But as soon as the elevator doors slid open and I stepped onto the floor, my heart sank. There he was, standing by my desk, his hands shoved into his pockets. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to send my carefully constructed resolve crumbling. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of us. "Good morning," I replied, my voice steady even though my heart pounded erratically in my chest, betraying my outward calm. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze locking onto mine as if searching for something unspoken. Finally, he asked, his tone measured but serious, "Can I see you in my office?" I gave a small nod of acknowledgement, my stomach twisting into anxious knots. Without a word, I placed my bag down gently on the nearby table and followed him. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, each step amplifying the storm of nerves building within me. As we entered the office, the door clicked shut behind me with an unsettling finality. He gestured toward the chair in front of his desk, silently inviting me to sit, but I remained rooted where I stood, my arms folded tightly across my chest, a shield against the vulnerability I felt creeping in. He let out a soft sigh, running a hand through his disheveled hair in a gesture that betrayed his unease. He leaned back against the edge of his desk, his shoulders slightly slouched, as if the weight of the moment bore down heavily on him. "I know we said we'd keep our distance," he began, his voice low, tinged with regret. "But I can't do it anymore." The air between us seemed to thicken, his words hitting me with a force I wasn't prepared for. My breath hitched involuntarily, and I looked away, my chest tightening painfully as emotions warred within me. "David," I murmured, my voice barely audible, the name slipping past my lips before I could think better of it. "I know it's not fair to you," he interrupted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I know this isn't what we agreed, but I need you to know the truth, how I feel." I turned my gaze back to him, my pulse racing as if my heart could sense what was coming next. "And how do you feel?" I asked, my voice trembling though I tried to keep it steady. He looked down briefly, as if summoning the courage to say the words aloud. When he spoke, his voice cracked, raw with vulnerability. "I'm in love with you," he admitted, the confession seeming to sap the strength from him. "And I don't know how to stop it, Emily. I don't know what to do." The weight of his admission struck me like a tidal wave, pulling me under. I felt a sting behind my eyes as tears threatened to spill, but I blinked them back. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, because I did, but the words caught painfully in my throat, unspoken and heavy. "Say something," he urged, his voice breaking, the raw emotion evident in his plea. "I can't," I whispered, shaking my head slightly as my voice faltered. "I can't do this, David." His shoulders slumped as though the fight had drained out of him, and he turned his head away, his fists clenching at his sides. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The resignation in his tone was unbearable. I hesitated, my heart aching as I stepped closer, reaching out without thinking. My fingers brushed lightly against his hand, a fleeting connection that I couldn't bring myself to pull away from. "David," I said again, softly this time, his name laced with all the emotion I couldn't otherwise express. He met my gaze then, his eyes reflecting a storm of emotions, pain, hope, love, and resignation, all at once. "I don't want to lose you, Emily," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "You won't," I assured him, though my voice betrayed me by breaking mid-sentence. "But we can't keep doing this. It's tearing both of us apart." He nodded slowly, his expression riddled with pain he didn't bother to mask. "I know," he replied, his voice heavy with defeat. For what felt like an eternity, we stood in silence, the unspoken emotions between us nearly suffocating. The moment stretched taut and fragile until I finally took a step back, the distance feeling both necessary and unbearable. "Goodbye, David," I whispered, the words like shards of glass on my tongue as I forced them out. I turned and walked away, each step taking me farther from him but leaving pieces of my heart behind, scattered in that room where we had shared everything and yet resolved nothing. He didn't try to stop me as I walked out the door, offering no words or gestures to make me hesitate. But as soon as my foot stepped into the elevator, a single tear slipped down my cheek, betraying the calm mask I'd tried to maintain. It was as if, the moment I left the threshold, reality set in fully. Whatever this was, whatever had been between us, it was over now. Yet, despite knowing that, a deep ache settled in my chest, raw and unrelenting. It was a pain that told me it wasn't truly the end. No, it couldn't be. There had to be more to this story, even if we had reached an unspoken conclusion. The days following our final conversation were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. The office, once a place of routine and collaboration, now felt like a battlefield. Each interaction, each glance, felt laced with tension, as if we were both walking on fragile ground. Every exchange was carefully calculated. Small talk became an art of avoidance, and any meaningful conversation seemed impossible. I buried myself in work, pouring my energy into every task I could find, hoping that by keeping my head down, I could outrun the storm raging inside me. I tried to outrun the thoughts and feelings that threatened to overwhelm me, but no matter how hard I worked, the weight of what had gone unsaid, of the space that had grown between us, hung over me like an oppressive storm cloud, waiting to burst. Mr. Carter, for his part, was no better. He kept up appearances, his usual commanding presence intact during meetings. His voice remained as calm and authoritative as ever, never betraying any emotion or hint of what might be simmering underneath. But it was in the subtle shifts, the small details, that I saw the truth. The strain in his eyes, the tightness in his posture, they spoke of a man struggling to hold on to control. He avoided speaking to me unless absolutely necessary, and when he did, his words were clipped, measured, and impersonal, so different from the easy rapport we once had. It was as though we had both silently agreed to build walls around ourselves, but neither of us knew how to live behind them, how to be in the same room without the barriers that had risen between us. It was late on a Thursday evening, the kind of quiet that only comes when the workday has long passed and most people have already gone home. The office was nearly empty, the only sound the soft hum of the HVAC system. I was just finishing up, gathering my things to head out, hoping to escape into the solitude of my apartment where I could try to make sense of everything. I had just slung my bag over my shoulder, ready to leave, when his voice sliced through the silence, stopping me cold. "Emily." I froze, my heart giving a startled skip as I turned toward the doorway. He stood there, framed by the soft glow of his office light, his tie loosened and hanging loosely around his neck. The faint shadows under his eyes were unmistakable, a reflection of the toll the last few weeks had taken on him. I couldn't help but notice the subtle weariness in his posture, as if he, too, had been carrying an invisible burden. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" I managed to ask, my voice steady despite the storm that raged inside me, a battle between wanting to run and the desperate hope that something, anything, might change. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on mine as though searching for something unspoken between us. His hand motioned toward his office, a silent invitation. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. A part of me wanted to refuse, to turn away and walk out. But there was something in his eyes, a depth of emotion, that rooted me to the spot. I found myself nodding slowly, almost reluctantly, before following him into the room. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound amplifying the silence that hung heavily in the air. Every breath felt like it took more effort, and my pulse quickened with the tension between us. I sat down across from him, not knowing whether to speak or remain silent. He leaned against the edge of his desk, his posture rigid, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, and his gaze fixed on me with a quiet intensity that made it impossible to look away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore." His words cut through the tension, but the weight behind them made my chest tighten. I looked at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability that laced his tone. "Neither can I whispered, my voice betraying the emotions I had been holding back for so long. He let out a breath, his jaw tightening as he turned his gaze away from me. His hands clenched at his sides, as if fighting to keep control. "I've tried to keep my distance, Emily," he said, his voice softer now, almost reluctant. "I've tried to focus on my work, to put all of this behind me. But I can't. I can't stop thinking about you." My breath hitched at his confession. "David," I began, my voice trembling with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between us. "We talked about this. We agreed it was for the best." "I know," he interrupted, his voice sharp, as if the words stung more than he had expected. "But I can't do it. I thought I could, but I was wrong." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat growing as I searched for the right words to say. "What do you want me to say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid of the answer that might follow. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softening once again. "I don't know what I want. All I know is that I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." The raw honesty in his words made something shift within me, and I felt tears sting at the corners of my eyes. I had spent so long burying my own feelings that hearing him voice them was both a relief and a pain. "Neither can I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. He stepped closer, the intensity in his gaze deepening as if he were searching for an answer in my eyes. "Then let's stop pretending," he said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion I could no longer ignore. I looked up at him, my heart racing as I asked the question that had been hanging in the air between us. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care about you, Emily," he said, his voice firm now, as though he had made a decision that he couldn't take back. "More than I should. And I think you care about me too." The words hit me like a wave, overwhelming and undeniable. I looked away, my hands trembling as I clasped them tightly in my lap, trying to steady myself. The room suddenly felt too small, and I struggled to make sense of the feelings swirling inside me. "That doesn't change anything," I said, my voice trembling as I struggled to hold back the emotions threatening to spill over. "We can't." "Why not?" he demanded, his voice sharp with frustration, each word laced with an urgency I couldn't ignore. Why are we fighting this? Why are we making it so much harder than it has to be? Because it isn't right, I retorted, my voice faltering under the weight of everything I was feeling. Because if we go down this path, we'll hurt people, people we love, people we care about. Because no matter how much we want it, there's no way this ends in a way that won't destroy us. His expression faltered, the sharpness in his eyes dimming for just a second. And for a moment, I thought he might finally understand. But then he straightened, and his face hardened into something resolute, almost defiant. I don't believe that, he said, his tone quieter now but no less intense. I think we're just too scared to see the possibilities, too afraid of what might go wrong to imagine what could go right. His words hung between us, lingering like smoke in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I felt my defenses beginning to crack, the weight of his belief pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to give in, to let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance we could make this work. A part of me wanted to imagine a world where we could be together without everything else falling apart. But the reality of it all, what we stood to lose, the mess we'd be left to clean up, made that impossible. The stakes were too high. The risk was too great. I can't do this, I said at last, my voice breaking on the words like I was tearing myself in two. I could feel the tremor in my hands as I wiped away the tears that had started to fall, and the regret in my chest was suffocating. But he just nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of my refusal had crushed him. He took a step back, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, might beg me to reconsider. But all he did was give me a look full of quiet understanding, the kind that felt like an entire lifetime of silent goodbyes. I understand, he said quietly, the raw pain in his voice making my heart ache with every passing second. And as much as I wanted to hold on to him, to make everything right, I knew I had to leave. I had to walk away. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, my body stiff with the effort to keep moving. I had to get out of there before I lost my resolve, before I let the warmth of him pull me back in. But just as I touched the handle, his voice, so soft, so hesitant, stopped me in my tracks. Emily. I turned slowly, my heart shattering at the look on his face. The way he was watching me with such a mixture of sorrow and longing. It was as though he was trying to let me go even though it was the last thing he wanted. If this is goodbye, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, I want you to know something. What? I asked, my voice barely audible, like a fragile breath escaping in the silence between us. You've changed me, he said, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes glistening with something deeper than words could express. You've made me see the world in a way I never thought possible. You've made me crave things I never thought I deserved, things I never imagined would even be within my reach. And no matter what happens, no matter how far apart we drift, I will always be grateful to you for that. You've done something in me, Emily, something I can't undo. You've given me a part of myself I didn't even know was missing. His words, so raw and honest, shattered the last pieces of composure I had left. I felt the floodgates of my emotions break open, and before I could stop it, tears began to spill down my cheeks. My voice trembled as I whispered, barely able to keep my emotions in check. Goodbye, David. In the days that followed, everything felt like a blur, a haze of numbness and a mechanical routine that I couldn't escape. I went to work, completing my tasks with automatic precision, doing everything I could to avoid him, to keep the distance between us. But despite all the distractions, despite all the effort to fill my time with mindless activities, the aching emptiness in my chest never left. It lingered like a weight I couldn't shake off, a constant reminder of what I had lost. Jason, though he said nothing, noticed the change in me, the way I became withdrawn and distant. But instead of confronting me, he simply gave me the space I needed. His silent presence beside me was both a comfort and a painful reminder of how much I had drifted from him, how much had changed in such a short time. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, the quiet of the room almost suffocating, Jason reached out to take my hand. His touch was gentle, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile between us. Is everything okay? He asked softly, his voice carrying a concern I couldn't easily ignore. I hesitated, my throat tightening as the weight of everything I was holding in threatened to spill over. My eyes stung with tears I refused to let fall. I'm just tired, I said, the words feeling like the only thing I could manage to say in that moment. Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful, but he didn't press further. He knew better than to push me when I wasn't ready to talk, and for that, I was grateful. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was enough. He didn't try to fix things, he simply gave me the space to exist in my silence. And that was all I needed. A week later, I found the letter sitting on my desk. The envelope was plain, unmarked, and yet I recognized the handwriting immediately. My heart skipped a beat as I reached for it, my hands trembling as I carefully slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly smudged, as though written in a rush, a hurry to get the words out before it was too late. "I've been thinking a lot about us," the letter began. "About everything we've been through, about everything we've said, and everything we've left unsaid. I know I've made mistakes, and I know I've hurt you. For that, I'm truly sorry. But I don't regret meeting you, Emily. I don't regret caring for you, and I don't regret the time we shared, no matter how short it was. You've changed me, and I can never thank you enough for that. I will always be grateful for you, for the way you've shaped me, even if our paths have to part. Take care of yourself. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. David." The words blurred in front of my eyes as tears welled up again, the paper shaking in my hands. I blinked furiously, trying to clear my vision, but the more I read, the heavier the weight of his words became. They were simple, direct, but they carried the weight of everything we'd been through, everything we could never have again. I folded the letter carefully, as though it were something precious, and slipped it back into its envelope. As I wiped the tears from my cheeks, I realized that while I didn't know what the future held, there was one thing I was certain of: I would never forget him. Not ever. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing moment, the ache in my chest gradually dulled, though it never truly vanished. It lingered, a faint but constant reminder of everything we had once shared and could no longer have. David and I settled into an uneasy, unspoken understanding, exchanging only the bare minimum of words necessary to uphold the professional facade we both silently agreed to. Every glance, every brief moment when our eyes met across the room, was like a jolt, a reminder of the deep connection we had lost and the painful truth that we would never be able to reclaim what was once ours. One evening, long after the rest of the office had emptied, I found myself sitting at my desk, staring out the window. The city lights sparkled in the distance, their glow resembling distant stars scattered across the dark sky. The envelope containing his letter rested in the drawer beneath my desk, its edges worn and frayed from being opened and closed countless times. I had read its contents over and over, trying to find some hidden meaning in his words, some clue that would explain the way everything had ended, or perhaps give me some sense of closure. But each time, the words remained just as they were, simple, final, and devoid of the answers I so desperately sought. Suddenly, the soft sound of footsteps drew me out of my reverie. I turned to see David standing in the doorway of his office, silhouetted by the faint glow of the hallway light behind him. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We stood there for a moment, our gazes meeting briefly before the weight of silence settled around us. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. In some strange way, it felt almost peaceful, as if we both understood that we had reached the end of something that had once meant everything to us but now stood as a distant memory we could never return to. At last, David gave a small nod, a barely perceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good night, Emily," he said, his voice soft but steady, carrying with it a quiet sadness that resonated in the stillness of the office. "Good night, David," I replied, my own voice wavering slightly, betraying the emotions I was struggling to keep in check. Without another word, he turned and walked back into his office. A moment later, I saw the light flicker off, plunging the room into darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes fixed on the now empty doorway, feeling the weight of his absence in every inch of the space around me. The silence seemed to stretch endlessly, pressing in on me, but it was a silence that felt both suffocating and oddly comforting, as though we had finally reached the place where we no longer needed to speak to understand each other's pain. And so I lingered, lost in the quiet, knowing that this moment, this final, fragile connection, was the last thread tying us together in a world where nothing would ever be the same. The weight of it all settled down on me, enveloping me like a heavy, suffocating blanket, pressing down on my chest with a finality I couldn't escape. I understood, in that moment, that this was the end, not just of whatever fragile connection had been forming between us, but of a larger, irreversible conclusion. It marked the end of a chapter in my life that I could never return to, no matter how much I might wish otherwise. This was something I had to let go of, something I had to move on from, even though it felt like an insurmountable task, as though the very idea of moving forward was too difficult to comprehend. I took a slow, steadying breath, my mind swirling with a mix of emotions. Clutching my bag tightly, I began the walk toward the elevator. The sound of my heels clicking sharply against the cold, empty hallway was the only thing that filled the silence around me. Each step seemed to reverberate in my ears, a stark reminder of the finality of this moment. When the elevator doors finally slid closed behind me, sealing me off from that place, I allowed myself one last moment of reflection. I let myself think of him, just one final memory, one last image of everything that once was. And then, just as swiftly, I released it. I let it go, knowing that it was time to move on, to leave it all behind. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you haven't yet subscribed, I invite you to press the subscribe button. Your support, even if it seems like a small gesture, means a lot to us and drives us to continue creating content with heart. Don't forget to give it a like if you enjoyed what we shared today. Every interaction helps us grow and allows us to keep connecting with you through stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this community.